Good morning, evening, or night, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Saturday Sessions, episode 12. We've got Eric and I as our usual stalwarts, but we've got Stefan Nick from Switzerland joining us tonight to mix up the flavour. So let's get the ball rolling. Highlights of your week. What stood out to you this week?
I'll take this. It's been a family week, so it's a very different headspace, a very different environment with 5 extra people in the house, and it's called a theme of the week reinterpretation. U.S. Thanksgiving holiday in Mexico, and we had a lot of culinary fun trying to blend the flavors and made like cranberry salsa, and we made turkey tacos with a bunch of Thanksgiving inspired ingredients, but also tacos. Um, and that's actually led thinking about that and talking about that. It's led to a lot of practice reinterpretation for me and really thinking about on a few levels just the basic traditional practices like coach on the couch yesterday was so remind me again why you do stand-ups because that'll make your stand-up look completely different, and that's actually not bad as long as people are all on the same page, and that all the way up to a late night rambling conversation around the differences of how Agile is going to look in a world full of AI and the AI enabled workflows. And back to that thread of like, what are we just going to have to throw away and reimagine because it no longer is right for the new decision speeds or the new
Yeah.
tool chains or what have you. So that's been my week, plus a big pile of creating pink sheets for the first time in a long while, and uh, remembering the power and the joy of simplification and creating summaries, summarizing. There's the word I
Yeah,
want.
I,
It's
I,
early.
woke up, I woke up to your pick sheet photo this morning and went, that's probably the most productive week you've had in a while, which is interesting given you're in Thanksgiving mode.
Uh, Most productive knowledge capture week for sure. Now, to be fair, that was a summarization of 8,000 words of prose that I have crafted over the last month. But the distillation was its own distinct exercise, and I rewarded myself for each one with a Dolly generated image.
Which was the extra bit of fun flavour.
Hmm.
Stefan, what about you?
Otherwise, it's a wall of pink.
Yeah, so I'm experiencing the end year rally. Lots of our customers still have some budget. They want some workshops, some training. So the weeks are full with workshops and trainings. And a specific thing I experienced again is before a POPM training, one of the stakeholders said, you will have two very complicated persons in there from the business. Be aware they will probably hijack your training and they will be critical. It won't be easy. And then I said, oh, don't tell any names. I don't want to know because I don't want to focus on these two people. I just want to go into the course and find out what it is without having the information. And interestingly, exactly those two people showed up in the first coffee break and could spill out what really bothers them, what their expectations are, and these were the best contributors over the last 2 days. So keep an open mind. Um, find out what's really bothering people, and not only stick to a content of a course and trying to achieve that. It's the goal was totally different in that course, and yeah, that was a big reward for me, and I really learned a lot, like from a
Nice.
personal perspective and from a human.
Very nice. I'm with you on the don't tell me who the VIPs are system.
Yeah.
I always want to know who the title's VIPs, but not the emotional load. Like I don't want to know where people's stances are.
for me, it's always important to not to frame things too early, right? Keep it open field. Let's even have the freedom to see where it goes. I sometimes in some courses, I like on day 2, I said, guys, you can read the slides on your own. I will give you the main messages so that you can sit the certification, but obviously we have other things to cover now, so that you leave with a happy face and a backpack full of perhaps to-dos, good inspiration, and that's how I try to with the people or for the people.
So does your financial year line up with the calendar year over in Switzerland, does it? Is it end of
Yep.
the year for you at the end of December?
It's end of autumn, end of financial year, so everything comes together. Christmas time is the culmination point, right? So yeah.
That must feel very different. It's so June 30's end of year for us. So the crazy we've got budget to spend time is late May, early June.
Yeah.
And
why does everybody want that to be end of winter? In the middle of winter.
Yeah, here it's different. You know, we are looking forward to go skiing. It's the 4th season, and you live it. You like it. You change to winter tires. You're safe. Well, it's okay. That's the way it goes.
yeah, it's December's very different for us because everybody's getting prepared for a ghost town for a month, because foundationally, pretty much every company will close down for 2 weeks over Christmas. But then because everybody takes their holidays, Australia Day is 26th of January for us. It's a long weekend. And you can't count on having a full roster back in the office from probably the 20th of December until the last week of January. So the mode of December is people priming themselves for dealing with the 4 or 5 weeks of crazy.
Okay.
That's funny. Ours shifts and rotates the other way a little bit, and it's basically this week, because it's a Thanksgiving in the U.S. is a 2-day holiday. It's usually a 3-day week, and you might get 1, maybe 2 more full weeks between now and Christmas proper. But you start to see the scattering drop off of everybody has to use their unused holiday time, use it or lose it mode, and all this stuff starts to creep in, and it's really hard to get a real class scheduled during traditionally a real full focus class trip scheduled after the first week of December. But we're back 4th of January. Like once it's over, it's over.
Yeah.
So what's your highlight, Mark, of the week?
It's an interesting one. Eric sent me a message when he was waking up going, help me get my brain going, give me a fire up for the week. And it wasn't a high creativity week for me. Like after the last 2 weeks where I was in full creative mode, this week was kind of catching up on admin I was behind on and tidying up loose ends. I think if I had to pick a highlight, what would the highlight be? Probably be the debrief session I had on Friday about the follow-up that's been happening from last week's product owner course. Yeah, you design a learning experience, you have some things you hope will turn into action. And, they had planned a follow-up regroup early this week to go, let's synthesize all of our takeaways and let's agree on the improvement backlog. And yesterday was the catch-up with their executives and their RTE to go, what did they agree and what support do they need? And what was great was to see that the priority list they came up with was exactly the priority list I would have designed for them. So that was really nice. Couple of other good moments. Great facilitation session Thursday. The group that I've been taking through the kind of weekly facilitation stuff just had their first big solo venture. They did. There's a whole bunch of reteaming going on. So we had them each design a team inception workshop based off your Love Heart canvas, Eric. You'll be pleased to know.
For the team relationships and the upstream, downstream, and so on.
Yeah.
Nice.
So they'd all been through creating a facilitation plan. It was a 3-hour inception. We'd had some kind of coaching moments about the way they were structuring their facilitation plan going into it. They'd all run it. And then Thursday was the kind of facilitate the debrief. And it was nice. They were all very excited and felt great about the outcomes they'd achieved and really saw the reward of the extra preparation they'd put in. So it was a really nice way to kind of wrap that series of facilitation workshops with them.
Sounds rewarding.
I love seeing people excited because they've achieved something new. That gives you good feelings.
I call it the gold medal, the hidden one, right? You're not standing in first line receiving that medal, but you earn it and you own it. That's what drives me. That's the passion that people also can probably, and you both probably experience that as well. Preparation time, teaching, coaching, and then debriefing. It's something that shines through. People can feel that, right? It's not just a curriculum, it's not just content, it's much more behind it. And that's probably what changed the most the last few years for me as a trainer, as a coach, sometimes even as a mentor. Just stepping back from the back of the room. You can ask, you can influence. That's really the interesting part of my life. That's why I said before we started, it's kind of interesting how the collaboration with you guys as well and others intensifies over the time and triggers totally new stuff that I wasn't aware of. So I'm really grateful.
So we were riffing on the way in just before we hit the start streaming button, going, we've got nothing really big to talk about tonight. It's been fun to just follow our noses the last 2 weeks. And I mentioned that, so I have quite a long checklist I've developed for setting up for a stream. It's fundamentally the list of every mistake I've made when setting up for a stream that I discover madly on the air. And tonight I was setting up for the SBC's Unleashed stream earlier, and I went, I don't need the checklist anymore. I've done this lots now. Tick, 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 tick. Fire everything away. And one of the items on the checklist is go into the stream manager and set the title for the stream. And guess what? I'd forgotten that in my It's Now Automatic. So we went live for the stream. Welcome to SPC's Unleashed episode 4. And in Twitch chat, up comes, welcome to the 5th Discipline Book Club, episode 7.
Okay.
And Eric's like, checklist manifesto. Let's talk about that. So tell us a bit more about Togon.
What is it, Eric?
So it's one of those books. Honestly, it's a checklist manifesto by Tel Gawande. And it's early and I haven't had enough sleep, so I'm not going to be the first off the Amazon link today. But the book itself is it's one of those things that in retrospect seems quite obvious that it's a book that needed to be written, and it's a book that the title kind of tells you the book. But it's story after story and anecdote after anecdote of why checklists need to be part of practice. And for me, it goes back to Reinertsen and his conversation about it's not people plus process, it's people times process. Your process should reinforce the humans because you're driving a nuclear submarine and you can't afford the mere 5 nines that process or people can provide, or you have no subs. And you play that forward into Checklist Manifesto and you think about nursing and doctors and surgical teams and that kind of environment. You think about how almost religiously pilots use their checklists every flight because it's good doctrine and it's good safety. Um, and then he starts to, if I recall correctly, it's probably been 12, 14, 15 years since I've read this book. It starts to cascade down into ever more everyday things where I have a couple checklists right here that are useful and on my desk for things I do frequently enough that I want to see them. And that's just an airproofing tool, and it's not perfect, but it reinforces humans and frees up cognitive load at the moment when you're distracted by the most things. So you've got routine, you've got habit, and you've also got this thing that you can go, yep, because you've done it 1,000 times before and you don't have to think about it, which is exactly why you need it.
That resonates with me because I'm an economically lazy guy, right? If I can lower the cognitive load, or if I can take out variability out of a system through a checklist, I'll do it. That's the other aspect for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it frees my brain for other stuff, which is then probably more crucial than memorizing checklists or improve quality or whatever.
So it's one of the places where, like, if you just leap away and you play with the metaphor, a good Kanban is a checklist.
Okay. Well, I'll sit with that one for a second as you continue talking, Mark.
I'm listening carefully now.
So it's one of the things that I feel is heavily underutilized by people in Kanbans is exit policies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now we're back aligned.
And it's that notion that says you can take whatever path you like through this step, but you've got shared clarity that, done with this step and ready for the next step means this. And that notion that says, and back to your Reinhardt quote, right, around process and policy, your Kanban is like your living process and your living set of checklists. And, the number of times I've had a team that just, they couldn't find a way out of their backlog just being a huge list of tasks that no user would ever care about. And going, well, what happens if we take a thing you do and turn it into a Kanban lifecycle and a set of exit policies? And the switch that happens in people's mind when they do that, and the change that happens for their reflection and adjustment of their process.
That one's an interesting one. So I taught a lot of Kanban as an accredited Kanban trainer, and that's where I started my agility journey. And it was interesting to me to see the difference between the teams that triggered the switch of, oh, we can encapsulate this without making it painful.
Yeah.
And the teams that struggle to see what they do as a repeatable process.
Yeah.
And like that right there was, and I'm trying to think right now, does that correlate 100% or close to it with the number of teams who had no DevOps or continuous integration flow and had to learn that layer from the ground up? I mean, this was 2006 and 7 where, yeah, in theory, build systems and CI was common, but it was much less common.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the whole factory mindset gets really interesting.
Listening to you, Mark, triggers in my head that you think about what we do and how we do stuff is a lot about product discovery, experimentation, and the Kanban then helps me to guide and keep those experiments into a certain range, and also through all the aspects that you have in there, like the policies, like the DoD, how do you pull it into the next state, helps you to grasp the experiment in a better way. You keep it in a flow, and again, you reduce some of the variability without taking away the option of exploring and perhaps even finding out new stuff That wasn't even the intention, and that's the beauty as well. And if you can instill that back to a team or a team of agile, that's when you start talking about moving away from structures and checklists, although having it like a backbone.
Yeah, the last team I did it with, they were doing integrations. Right? And they've been doing integrations for a while, and they said, look, it's a repeatable thing. We know exactly the stages we go through. We know the questions we ask ourselves at each stage that might indicate the pattern of the integration. And, there was a question where, it was like, is there any way you can shrink it, like through a story splitting metaphor, any way you can shrink it to be smaller than the integration's done? And it was no, right? The various sort of U-curve trade-offs in their interaction with the source systems was like, no. And so we literally, and you looked at their backlog, and it was just a very, very long task list and a team that spent life talking about their tasks. And we went, how about we just throw all that away? And we'll have a Kanban, and the Kanban will represent the cycle you go through for an integration. And, the exit policies will, what you have to have locked in at each stage of the Kanban, change your conversation. And, there were some pretty long checklists. But the change in the team, I checked in with them a few weeks later and went, how are you finding it? They said, our conversations have completely shifted. We're not talking about tasks anymore. We're talking about integrations. And the focus switch of the team was huge. So that was interesting. It's also played out for me a lot with teams that do predictive modeling, prescriptive modeling, where it's train a model, spin the wheel a few times training the model, and you talk to them about breaking up a backlog, and they go, spin the wheel once, spin the wheel twice, spin the wheel 3 times, spin the wheel 4 times. There's our PI plan. It's like, okay, maybe this would be better thought about a different way. But I'm going to jump us away from checklists because you just sparked a memory for me early in this. And it was when you're talking about the manifesto, the checklist manifesto, and the pilot thing. Did any of you guys read Blackbox Thinking?
Not that I recall by that name.
So Blackbox Thinking was fundamentally a book about learning from failure in the airline industry. And
Okay.
and the premise of the book was that no other industry has got as good at safe to fail learning as the airline industry has, which was kind of confronting, right? I heard about it. I was in London teaching an SPC to a bunch of coaches, and we were sitting drinking and talking that night. One of them was like, Blackbox Thinking. This is what it's about. I've got to try that. And the whole story of the book is that small errors and making a world where it's safe to report a small error was absolutely critical to preventing large errors.
Mm-hmm.
And, they talked a lot about the way they had to educate the pilots and the staff. So one of the examples they gave, and it was a beautiful example, they talked about pilots. There was a pattern of pilots self-reporting that they'd made mistakes on approach to a particular airport. And they saw this pattern emerge of pilot after pilot from numerous airlines reporting a mistake in their approach flight path. And they went, oh, there's a problem there. Let's go and investigate. And what they found was that there was a warehouse nearby that had just installed some big, very bright advertising on its roof.
Okay.
And the advertising on the roof of the warehouse was interfering with the sight lines that they were used to relying on and causing this deviation for the pilots. And so they were then able to intervene. and this was the premise of the book all the way through was, how do they go about creating a culture where a pilot not only felt safe but felt morally obliged to self-report errors, but then create a culture that said the self-reported error was a trigger for a learning opportunity, to avoid learning from black boxes of crash planes.
But I've never read that, but a lot of those showed up in Henry Petrosky's work on design and failure, which was actually, it was a gift from a friend of my grandmother's when I was, I don't know, 10 or 12, somewhere in that era. I can picture his home, but not myself, as children are probably want to do. And he handed me a book on failure. And it was like all the big classic failures and the engineering studies and the looking into the chain of events and the compounding factors that lead to them. And I think I've probably read half a dozen or more of his books over the years. But the end result of that is, one, I decided to be an engineer. So it definitely set me somewhat on that path. But it really resonates with what you're talking about and the idea of checklists and that whole mindset of find small things now. To the point that it's actually one of the, if I picture Gene's new book as a 3x3, it's one of his 9 is amplification of those signals. It's definitely hasn't stopped being relevant in our space, and yet it's countercultural to many of the companies I work in.
Very much.
That's interesting. I just Googled, and the 5 big ideas behind this black box thinking, one of them caught my eye. It says, when we are confronted with evidence that challenges our deeply held beliefs, we are more likely to reframe the evidence than we are to alter our beliefs. And that resonates to what we discussed this morning, or in our last stream. Mark, you're smiling, right?
Well, I'm smiling because it takes us back to Friday's fifth discipline. So there was one of the stories that so it was only 2 of us this week. Eric was slacking off doing Thanksgiving stuff. But one of the stories that
Hey, it was a nice beach.
We'd both done a green highlight on was a story about Detroit executives on a visit to Toyota, just when the interest was first starting to happen. And they took this group of Detroit executives through to look at a Toyota plant. And Sengi was actually talking to one of the execs after the visit. And he probed him and said, "What did you think?" And the exec goes, "Well, that was obviously staged, right? There was nothing to learn." Because they had staged a fake tour for us. And Sengi goes, "What made you think it was faked?" And the Detroit guy goes, "I've been in this industry for a very long time. And I can tell you can't run a factory without inventory. And they're running us through this factory with no inventory and trying to make us believe that it's a real factory." and Sengi uses it as this example of a mental model that, what's the filter you apply to the thing you see? Yeah, it was a beautiful story.
Oh, wouldn't that mean that based on the evidence, you still don't believe that you have to change, right? You probably would accept part of the evidence, but not for your context. You would say they probably can do it, but not us.
Well, these guys were in denial that it was even being done. They just went, it's
sure.
They put the quote in about, any sufficiently advanced technology appears like magic.
But you play that out. How many times I've heard from students, well, that's all well and good, but in the real world.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly the same thing. It's like he presented with a concept. It's like, yeah, this is a cute idea. Ironically, as the ending of the Royce paper on waterfall, cute idea, but it'll never work in the real world.
Well, the number
Yeah,
of
but
the sorry, go on, Stefan.
okay, you go first.
I
You
was
go
just going
first,
to say the
Mark.
number of architects who sat in a course and told me that Amazon and Google's architectural landscape is so much simpler than theirs. And, the DevOps concepts would never work in a real landscape and not one as simple as Google and Amazon's, right? And you just kind of process that in terms of the architectural
What
landscape of Google and Amazon. It's like, wow.
Yeah,
Well,
what Eric said resonates with me in each of my courses, right? You show them a target picture, you even bring in real examples, and they say, yeah, but that's the picture, but could I see it? That's one of the questions. And when I say, okay, you come with me, I'll show you. I experienced as well that they're still in denial. Yes, for them it works, but not in our context. Okay. And then the next step will be, okay, if I come and we take some time and we go through and we make it happen, that's when like 50%, they just bail out, say, no time, we don't want to. But they question me or they challenge me, right? And that's an interesting situation.
well, so
That
there,
a lot of the people would like to do it, the other ones, they oppose it.
So there, we're at an interesting risk of going sideways to a complete new topic. So I'm going to go in ahead first. Um, that's where things like the challenger sales model start to get really powerful. And so challenger sales is from the CEB, Corporate Executive Boards, one of their domain-specific models they publish. But I found it to be a very useful way to think about the sales process and this concept of rational drowning and getting well enough aligned that the person you're talking to believes in your empathy is what it boils down to. And they don't use that word in the same way because it's a sales book. But as a coach and consultant, it was, do I truly understand not just your environment, but the emotions and everything else you have wrapped up around your environment, such that you believe I am credible when I tell you that it's not only what you see, it's actually worse than that. And yet there's a way out. And taking them, it's like, yeah, you're here. You actually need to go deeper before you're willing to bob back up and go through this arc. And it's not fun to do from a coaching model. Like it feels like inappropriate coaching in some cases, but it's a wonderful sales technique. But there's a depth of reality there is they have to believe in your empathy and credibility before they would be willing to engage cognitively with the solutions you're offering. And the moment I learned to observe and discover in a sales conversation is, and it actually applies in coaching too, is really as a coach or as a guide of the conversation, coach is the wrong term there, listening for the moment when their objections stop being it won't work and start being how will it work. And there's a very subtle shift at some point during the conversation where you've jumping metaphors yet again, you're at risk of ripping the hook out from a fishing point of view. Like you've got them then. Once somebody's like, how is it going to work? They're in, and you're now their peer problem solving with them, as opposed to trying to convince. And I don't see that dance done well very often, but it's incredibly relevant to what we're talking about here.
It's playing with metaphor switching and avoiding the temptation to go even further sideways.
I mean, I can add a new chapter marker.
But going back to the black box thinking, Mark and Eric, what springs to my mind is first principle. You apply first principles. You break down stuff to the bare minimum, trying to figure out what really works and what doesn't. How would you relate first principles to black box?
I think for me, what really struck me when I read it was a little bit like Turn the Ship Around. But you think Turn the Ship Around, and what's super powerful about Turn the Ship Around is decentralized decision making on a nuclear submarine. right? It creates such a startling and surprising place to imagine it happening that, how do I put it? So Jerry Weinberg had one of his models for leadership interventions. He said, there are various ways in which you can frame an intervention, and one of them is jiggling.
Is what?
Jiggling. and his concept of jiggling was, what's the thing you do that just changes the paradigm, right? It transports somebody from the world they're in to a different world to enable something to unlock. And, for me, the whole turn the ship around context is it's a jiggle. We've just talked about decentralized decision making. Oh, and by the way, here's a guy who did it on a nuclear submarine. And I think the same thing for me about Blackbox Thinking is, let's create a safe to fail world. And by the way, here's an example of how they did this in the airline industry.
That reminds me of so it was a debrief I had with a executive after a very successful, very stressful program that lasted most of a year. And it was that conversation as a coach where it's like, okay, well, you solved this huge problem for us. What do you want to do for us next? And they're delightful conversations, but he said something in that call that flipped my entire brain about the perspective around Agile that he held. So this was 2000, I think it was 2011 timeframe, maybe 12, just to put a context, maybe even 13, but a decade ago. And we come out of this program, he's like, well, yeah, clearly it works on large things, but I mean, how would Agile ever work on my small stuff?
Oh, that's glorious.
And it's like, I did not have a response because it just completely shattered my mental paradigm around, like, what do you mean? We've been barely stretching agility up into what you've been solving. It's made for small stuff. But he hadn't seen it. So his mental model of Agile was Agile program management. It was a tool to align 500 plus people around a $100 million program to bring everybody together to deliver the most important stuff first at that scale. He'd never seen it in the small. He hadn't heard about it in the small. Like there wasn't, and due to the nature of the program, we didn't actually kick that one off with meaningful team level development. It was actually, we intervened at the program level where everything was broken. So I'm not sure how that connects back to Blackbox Thinking, but it's just that mental shift and that moment of rotation that a good story creates. I remember that one happening to me in that moment. The narrative was different. This completely shattered all of my storylines about Agile in that moment. Like I put it all back together, but it was a big moment for me.
It's almost like my story of the organization where the business at the most senior levels was desperate for Agile. And the technology CIO desperately didn't want it.
I've seen that more than I care to think about, which is a weird one, but lots of fears that you have to dig into when you talk to people about those situations.
Yeah. So since we're in the black box world, I just grabbed a couple of notes from my highlights and realized just how much I highlighted in that book while I was scanning for a couple of notes. So just a bit of a flavor of some of the stuff that's in there, right? Failure is rich in learning opportunities for a simple reason. In many of its guises, it represents a violation of expectation. Back to our mental model concept. Errors can be thought of as the gap between what we hoped would happen and what actually did happen. Cutting-edge organizations are always seeking to close this gap, but in order to do so, they have to have a system geared up to take advantage of the learning opportunities. Here's a doozy. When the probability of error is high, the importance of learning from mistakes is more essential, not less. And just one to take us away from it. Intelligence and seniority, when allied to cognitive dissonance and ego, is one of the most formidable barriers to progress in the world today. What a glorious quote.
Yep. So I'm trying to think, like it's an interesting read. Like it sounds like, and I'm looking, I put my Chat GPT summary next to it which is my version of understanding the book right now, my mental model of the book. And it's really interesting to think about, like, I'm not hearing anything new here, but it's another one of those books that bundles together new examples in a powerful way that makes them useful for a broader audience.
So if you think about it, and I think, going back to perhaps a coaching lens on it and a language, and you and I have talked about this a little bit recently in the creative mode, Eric. When you're in the moment as a coach, what you're looking for is the story, the example, or the provocation that's right for that moment in time for that group of people, right? And the kind of flip side to that, Eric and I have been chatting about a bit, is when you're writing or when you're developing training content, you're not necessarily sure of the moment in time and the context that's going to be true. So you have to be even more aware of the people. But I like to collect stories and examples so that in a particular moment in time, I can just reach into the back pocket and go, this feels like a good story here. Right? Was there anything in this book that told me something I hadn't known about the importance of safety to fail? Or the type of stuff you might employ when chasing a kind of learning from failure world? Not really, but there were a couple of nuances. But was it great to be able to go, here's a bunch of examples from a high-risk, safety-critical industrial setting of things that people have done to create a safe to fail environment? And I think sometimes you read a book and the value of the book is the story that you can go in your back pocket, almost more than the new techniques that it gives you.
Yes, but it depends on depends on the book. Like that's not why I read Reinertsen, but it is
No.
why I read Gene Kim. Like he creates wonderful vignettes that people resonate, and you can then talk about people.
Yeah.
Like you mention the characters, and it's now a shared language.
Yeah.
It's related to this, but one of the pieces of advice I picked up and I formalized based off, I think it was Ryan Polk talking to him years ago, and became part of my standard toolkit for helping new coaches, is find your 5 stories. Get those 5 examples of places you have experience in your head, such that you can pull one of those 5 to be an example anywhere you're at. And you can always have a real story based in fact, based in reality, that you are able to share to illustrate some aspect of agility. Because that way it doesn't stay theoretical, either for you or for them. But it mostly talked about the them as part of the coaching guidance.
That's exactly what I do when I'm doing Train the Trainer with people preparing to train.
Mm-hmm.
Is
you got to have your 5.
Well, I don't limit it to 5. I literally go, work your way through the material. Know that every time you tell a real story, it's going to bring it to life for the audience. And you're not necessarily going to tell every story you've got prepared, but work out the set of stories that you feel are really going to bring to life something, so that you've done the pre-thinking and you've figured out how you might stretch and contextualize the story for the moment to add that thing. Because when you're an experienced trainer or experienced coach, you've got the memory back. But
I don't know. I'm actually going to argue a little bit on. I'm going to say we're doing different things there, because I wasn't thinking of it at all in a training space. I use it there deeply.
Yeah.
But it's, as a coach, as somebody who's attempting to make things real for people, it's less about having 5 stories. It's about having 5 places, 5 scenarios and experiences that you then can draw as many stories as you need to out of. So it's a shift of the level of abstraction going on. It's at a certain way. because I could build a story for each slide. I mean, I could tell 5 stories for every slide in any of the decks.
Yeah.
But when I limit myself to 5, limiting WIP, my stories then themselves start to have a coherence for my audience.
So this, of course, is mental model. Because when you
Mhm.
said 5 stories, I went 5 stories to your favorite, as opposed to 5 sources of stories.
Yes, 5 sources of stories, 5 experiences, 5 contexts.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, okay, I have my tiny startup context. I have my $500 million or my $100 million 500 person story. I have my leading the transformation at CA across 5 business or 6 business units story. I have that other healthcare company that I won't name, and I have a couple more like industrial type experiences in my back pocket. Off of those 5 plus 1 or 2, 5 plus or minus 2. But off that handful of stories, depending on the context I'm speaking to, pretty much every single point in Agile, Kanban, Lean, everything else has a home against a coherent background.
That's
And
interesting. That's interesting. During my final pairing with Andy Sales on day 2, we discussed what would it be if we challenge ourselves not to teach the content of a slide, but to have one message or one story, and bring that over. And that's listening to you guys, that resonates with me, right? Not having 5 plus minus whatever stories, but how do you convey the message in a way that it lands? And if you go back to let me quickly go back to Blackbox Thinking again. Redefining failure, right? That's probably the most challenging one for me, that people don't see it as a failure. How do you assess it? And I've learned from a professor. He led me through his lab, and he showed me 2 types of experiments. He said, these are experiments. They try to support the hypothesis of this student or this PhD candidate. And then he showed me a series of experiments where he said these guys will be the successful ones because they try to invalidate the hypothesis, right? So 2 types of stories, and I use them quite often as well. Some more, do I have stories that pay again into my model and into my perspective, my lens, or is it really stories that help people to then kind of leave their garden, jump the fence, and see it from a totally
Steve Denning has a wonderful body of work on leadership storytelling. And for some reason, I've never been able to fully finish the books, but I keep coming back to concepts from them despite not finishing the book, which is one of those rarities for me. It's like I get a lot of value and I don't finish. And I think it's mostly distraction because it's when I tend to pick up in weird spots.
That can be writing style too, though.
It could be. I like his writing style. It's just, I think I get distracted by other things frequently while reading his books. Is probably more accurate.
I don't think I've read any of his books, but for me, the classic for that was Alistair Cockburn back when he was writing. And
he's writing again, by the way.
Oh, okay. So I haven't read anything recent, but I used to, I read Crystal Clear. I read his use case book. I read something else that he wrote, and what I concluded in the end was that he writes an amazing first chapter. Right, his first chapter is always just spectacular, and then the rest of the book is kind of a waste of time because he's told you everything important in the first chapter, and all he's doing is kind of filling in the detail in the rest of the book. So I reached a conclusion that said if I read an Alistair Cockburn book, I read the first chapter, there's brilliance. And then I don't worry about the rest of the book.
I think I like that. I still think I like that better than Lencioni's, where it's like, to skip to the end if you want to know the model, because there's a book full of storytelling and then a little bit of crunch at the end.
I love the parables, though.
All right. So maybe
But you
maybe
mentioned-
go ahead.
Go ahead, Eric. Go.
I was thinking maybe we put the two together. You get a beautiful parable. You get a brilliant, crunchy first chapter. And then you get the expansion of the ideas in the first chapter after the parable that can go on another 200 pages in case you ever need a reference.
Yeah. There you go.
But I guess, Eric, we're clever book readers, right? You have different approaches. If the Pareto rule applies, going through the first chapter, knowing everything, putting it aside, that's okay. I sometimes go at the end and try to find out what's the final line, like in a novel, right? That's okay. So how do I get the most out of it in an economical way? Why should I read all the pages?
All these days, you read the first chapter and then you use ChatGPT because the first chapter tells you the questions. And then you put the prompt into ChatGPT to say, in this book, provide the detail that the author had to provide about topic X. Never have to read a whole book again when they're written that style.
Tempting. That just means you don't get to read any new books. You have to wait until it gets into the data window.
There is that. I'm going to jump away because you guys reminded me of a fun story, the whole storytelling thing. It's a few years ago now. I was doing a workshop on scaling agility with the executive leadership at a defense organization in England. And, it was a fairly full-on thing. Let's say that everything that I owned except my clothes had to be left outside the 5 doors that I had to run through Get Smart style to get in. And they gave an intro. The person who brought me in for this session gave an intro. And then sat down and I stood up, and then some head honcho in the room stood up and went, we need a clarification here, just so everybody in the room's aware, this is Mark's security clearance level. And the person who brought me in wound up getting a good old smack on the wrist for not having clarified my security level. So I stood up and I went, okay, well, sitting like this, I've got some stuff I can talk about, but usually I'd be asking you questions. And I'd be probing what kind of problems you're trying to solve, where you're running into trouble, what type of solutions. And it's feeling like the intro that you're not going to be able to answer any of the normal questions that I would ask to figure out what you want to talk about. And they went, yes, you'd be thinking correctly. And I went, well, I do have a few slides because they gave me a chance to, wow, that's a beautiful looking sunset. Squirrels. I'd been able to get some slides in. I had to email them through 5 days before so they could do the vetting before they put the slides on an internal machine. I said, I've got some slides, or I can say, here's 5 contexts that I could share with you about different organizations and different types of problems and what they've done with scaled agility. And you tell me which one of those sounds interesting, and then I'll just tell you stories about what they did. So
How did that play out?
I just told stories. Wound up being a lot of fun. But it was a very interesting experience.
So how did that play out? Did they get the learning out of it?
Yeah,
Was it contextualized?
They loved it.
Did they slip and start talking, get excited talking to each other, and forget you were there?
No.
Okay.
No. It was a fun couple of days. I went out to one of the place where all their data geeks lived on the intelligence data front. And the brief to me had been get them excited about extreme programming. So I took my Lego XP activities with me. And I had this 60 white middle-aged men who were intelligence data geeks walk into a room where there was a pile of Lego on every table and proceeded to teach them about test-driven development, refactoring, pair programming, and continuous integration using Lego, which was definitely not what they expected.
Fun.
I just decided to give us a backdrop to the conversation since you've added it to the Miro board, Eric.
Okay. I've lost my view into the Sorry, I was looking at things that popped up elsewhere, and I'm like, I might as well share. Welcome to La Paz. That's Thanksgiving. Day before Thanksgiving, a couple days before Thanksgiving.
That's glorious.
It was one. It's interesting though, like complete tangent since we're looking at sunsets, but it's to the point that they're no longer random to me. In that I can see them developing a few hours before. I've learned which factors are going to create subtle sunsets versus pure gradient skies with nothing marring it versus glorious, chaotic, beautiful sunsets. Or in this exact same sunset, a little shift of where the clouds were over on the far shore of the bay, and you've got nothing. You've got flat, gray, boring sky with very little light, just depending on whether the cloud cover goes to the horizon or not.
Yeah.
And it's like learning how the structure is of a completely chaotic event. And I could probably draw this back to repeatable process in our first conversation today. And it's like, yes, it's completely chaotic. It's completely random. It's based on weather things that we can barely predict and very minor nuances. And yet, when you immerse in the space, these unpredictable events become less chaotic and more like the two outcome problem, like the spinning marble in the bowl that can either go in or out. And the path is chaotic, but the outcomes are actually partitionable. And I want a lot of our social challenges, I think, around agility fall in the same category. There, I made it relevant.
You figured if you just kept talking long enough, you'd find a way back in.
That's a coaching and consulting tool, right? I'm sure you're guilty of that, Mark. Stefan, I'm not so sure, but
Yeah, it's interesting. I just was thinking, if I'm in the US on those big plains,
Mhm.
where you see those huge sunsets, huge clouds, right? Compared to Europe and Switzerland, where I live in a space where you don't have that because of
Mhm.
the mountains, of the valleys. You have more like a microclimate, and even in my area, if it's raining here, like 3 k's over there, at the other end of the valley, it's dry and sunny. And relating that again to the lean agile world, sometimes I take the gondola, I go up to a mountain to see the bigger picture again, or to be above the clouds anyway, right? Because in November here it's gray. For weeks you don't see the sun if everything fails, and yeah, that's one of the good analogies I'm using quite often as well, right? Although I'm born here, I'm raised here, I enjoy it. It's a different climate, it's a different setup. Although I know there's other stuff, but where I live, it's totally in Ausland or in the US, right?
It is, but it's different but same. Because it's predictable. I mean, you're describing Denver to me. Denver sunsets are different because there's mountains and there's not enough because of the mountains west of the city. There's not enough angle for the sun to truly light the clouds in the same spectacular way. Oceans are almost always better because you have beautiful eternal curvature of the earth to get good red light to come up under the clouds.
Yeah.
Which is where being in Australia and I think 95% of our population living within 50 kilometres of a beach. You know the sunsets we're always going to take.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be very deliberate to get a long way away from a beach here.
But aren't like isn't like 3/4 of the population on eastern facing beaches?
Yeah,
I know you can,
probably even more than that.
because that also matters. There's certain things you can't change about the geometry of the planet. At least not easily with our current technology level.
But then there's a reality that says when I go down to the bay, I'm on a west-facing beach on the side of the bay that I'm on. If I go to my nearest surf beach, I'm on a south-facing beach. So when you take fractals into consideration, you got all kinds of fractals. At which point, I feel like we've probably hunted
Yeah,
hard
we
enough to drag this back to agility.
we should probably pick a topic now, because otherwise I'm just going to keep posting sunsets.
So there's a back channel comment from Stefan that he's got to leave and look after the boss shortly. Well, I didn't type it, but I knew it from talking to him before. So I thought, given that we've run out of steam on our sunset conversation, and now you're going for fireworks, surely to follow with some of your local costume photos. Wondering if that's a graceful moment to say farewell to Stefan, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for
Lovely to
having me.
have you. Welcome to Saturdays.
Welcome back.
I will.
Anytime you're in the mood, mate.
Perfect. So have a nice day. Have a nice weekend. See you guys.
See you soon. We'll change the name order. So, have you woken up enough to think of another seed topic yet, Eric, or are we going to call it a short one tonight?
I don't know. There's a couple different places I've started to go. One was when we were talking about Kanbans earlier. I did a coach on the couch on Colorbond this week. I don't know if you managed to catch that one.
No,
But
I caught you one about what, which you referred back to earlier.
yeah, but it's just thinking about process substitution or practice substitution, and how any given agile practice doesn't have a right way of doing it. It has some wrong ways of doing it, certainly.
Yeah.
But like a lot of the, I don't like the term holy wars, but they start to feel like that. A lot of the great debates where people refuse to see the other points of view tend to come out of contextualization of practices that result in a local right or wrong that doesn't become a global right or wrong.
Yeah.
And so there's a few different examples or threads we could go play with there. We could talk about pink sheets. Those are always fun. Where's your heart at?
So I guess the stuff that's in my heart today is probably not streamable.
Okay.
So it's been an interesting week for me emotionally. If you got somewhere interesting to take us, I can go there. I can also go, you know what? It doesn't have to be 2 hours every week. I'm easy either way.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do a wrap then.